Look, we might get going, otherwise people won't sit down. So good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a good refreshment at morning tea. My name is Joanne Daly, and I'm from the Australian eResearch Infrastructure Council, and also from CSIRO. And I'd like to welcome you to the 2012 eResearch Forum, which this year is entitled The Future of Australian eResearch Infrastructure. And we're here on behalf of the Australian Government Department of Industry, Innovation, Science, Research and Tertiary Education, and from now on in I will refer to this as the Department, and the Australian eResearch Infrastructure Council, which we also call ERIC. It's a great time to come together. It's a great time to celebrate, I think, the achievements to date in the eResearch infrastructure investments over the last 5 to 7 years. We'll also hear a little bit about what's coming, still yet to be invested, and then some planning for the future. The session will be done in 2 parts, and the first part will be a forum. We'll have 3 presentations of 15 minutes each, followed by questions to the panel. This year the focus will be on the growth in eResearch infrastructure and services, what's available now and what's expected to come online in 2013, the lessons we've learnt during the implementation and how these experiences are informing future planning. There are 3 people on the panel. Professor Tom Cochrane, who's the chair of ERIC. He also is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor from QUT. Ms Cheryl Cutt, Manager of the eResearch section from the department, and thirdly, Dr Rhys Francis, Executive Director of ERIC. After the panel discussion and questions and answer session, we'll then have part 2, in which we'll have the presentation of the James Tizard Memorial Prize, including a short presentation by the prize winner themselves. And then we'll break for lunch at 10 to 1. I'm not going to introduce the speakers in between each talk. I'm going to introduce the 3 of them now, their titles of their talks, and then we'll just flow from one talk to the other. So first off will be Professor Tom Cochrane, who will talk about eResearch in Australia, a present state reflection. He'll be followed by Cheryl Cutt, who will talk about moving forward in the broader context, the government perspective. And lastly will be Rhys Francis, who will talk about eResearch 2013, Open for Business, Advancing Discovery in an Information-Rich World. So thank you. I'll invite Tom Cochrane to the...
Thanks very much, Joanne. When I say reflection here, a reflection on what? Well, a reflection on how I think support and development of eResearch in Australia has occurred, a reflection at a fairly macro level from the position of chair of the Australian eResearch Infrastructure Council in late 2012, which is where we are, and we're going into some new developments next year, as we'll hear a bit later on. So one of the things that I think is always worth reminding us, again taking a big picture, is why governments and large institutions get involved in the first place. And there's a fairly familiar incantation here, which is that governments in most countries are interested in prosperity because that's how they define their success. In order to be prosperous, they try to preside over or assist dynamic economic development. I don't think there's any government in the 21st century that wouldn't intimately couple dynamic economic development with innovation and a culture of innovation. And in turn, we argue that innovation flows from healthy levels of research, and that research needs infrastructure, and the kind of infrastructure that we're talking about, again, in the times in which we live, is infrastructure which is e-infrastructure. In fact, one can well ask the question when we might stop using the little e in front of research and in front of the word infrastructure, because it will automatically be assumed that that's what we mean. We have different definitions of e-research. I sometimes wonder how many folk who are actually quite sophisticated researchers in our research institutions, if you ask them all at once what e-research is, what kind of responses you get. In Australia, this definition was developed during the roadmap process, and the reason for that wording, in fact, is that if you actually excise eResearch and talk about research infrastructure, you would have something very similar but without the ICT. But it really is about assets, facilities and services which support the kind of research that is intended to support the activities that I mentioned just before. And ways of thinking about the eResearch infrastructure, or to use the US term, the cyber infrastructure, has often been helpful at a policy level, or considering who may have the main responsibility for investment and how investment decisions are to be contemplated, to divide it into these sorts of levels. So what we need to be responsible for in our institutions, what we need to be responsible for regionally, and in particular how institutions in regions may play together or otherwise, what needs to be considered in terms of national facilities, and the exercise of thinking about national facilities since eResearch has been to think how those facilities are established through what's essentially interinstitutional collaboration, but for a national and nationally identified purpose. And then finally, what international and landmark facilities and services we might have, whether we're talking about marine exploration vessels or square kilometre arrays and so on. So that's the way that these things have been thought about in terms of thinking about investment. If we look at the Australian story over the last few years, we get a chronology which can be expressed as I've got here. So we start off with a variety of schemes in which research infrastructure is embedded in different ways. We've had a period of developing facilities under the banner of the Australian Partnership for Advanced Computing. We moved into the period of systemic infrastructure, and then we got the eResearch initiative starting mid-decade of the first decade of where we are now, and then of course the significant injection of funds that came with the super science decisions of 2009, bringing us through to the present time. One of the interesting things about Australia is the approach that's been taken to try and foster, as well as possible, the collaborative behaviours that have been intended, or at least conceived, in public policy as it's developed. And a central tenet of this was the lead agent technique, which has really developed since the eResearch period started. And if I might just give my own informal rendition of what that's about, it's been to think about what the priority areas are in the country, for the government to open up some informal negotiation with possible leads, that is, the lead who will become the lead agent in due course. It's been relatively informal, you could even say low-key, in terms of seeking an understanding of what should eventually happen. The lead agent takes on a responsibility to be helpful and to lead in collaborative effort in whatever the particular area of investment will be. Then there's a period of developing contracts, an announcement, and one of the intentions of the policy, of course, is not only to administer funding, the planned funding, but also to seek to leverage as much local and regional effort as possible. And there are a number of eResearch and super science investments that can demonstrate quite good outcomes in that regard. And finally, there's the question of responsibility and accountability once the decisions have been made and the money distributed. My own little rendition of some of the advantages and disadvantages of the Australian approach, and I haven't rinsed these closely with any of my colleagues. They're just a set of observations that I've made from the position of chair in the last few years. Have been, firstly, there's no body that's established that might develop its own sense of direction. And there's no large overlay in the sense of the things to be done. It's been possible to set up each of the initiatives with quite a clear purpose that becomes its banner and its label. It's absolutely involved needing to negotiate with peer institutions and peer individuals and influencers. How well that occurs can be variable across the initiatives, but it absolutely has required that. The negotiation process has often brought leveraging, and from my own part of Australia, which is Queensland, I've seen the way that that effect has developed, so that we've got really quite good integration with both state effort institutions in the state on a particular national initiative or set of initiatives. I suppose this next point is a bit like the first one in the sense that the lead agent technique seeks to assure that the agenda has some chance of following through on the original intention for this particular plan, for this part of the infrastructure. Some disadvantages. Well, despite what I said about not creating very large overlay bureaucracies, there are nevertheless overheads in the developing of the agreements, and any of the lead agents who become involved in that process, as well as the relevant government department folk, are aware of those overheads. In practice, you would have to say that the ability of the different lead agents that have developed over the period, their capability to deliver has been uneven. There was a wonderful session late yesterday afternoon called Epic Fails in eResearch, and I think it's fair to say that touched on the possibility that some of the capability for lead agent delivery was uneven. And of course, one of the things in play there is that the capacity of individuals to step up to what really can be quite a challenging role, to play their part in what's intended in the implementation of this policy and this investment, can be quite a significant challenge for folk. And there's a weird thing. I suppose it's got to happen really, but in Australia, where particularly our research institutions, our universities, have a Pavlovian competitive reflex about any sentence that has money and research in the same sentence. That although what's intended here is quite a sophisticated approach to interinstitutional and national collaboration, the winning of a lead agency can nevertheless be trumpeted by an institution as yet more evidence of its primacy in the Australian researcher sphere. And well, I guess, as I say, it's inevitable that it might happen. Sometimes it's gotten a bit much. And I think that there are some governance questions. There are some issues about how we check back on the way things have occurred. And I guess some of those themes may have come up yesterday afternoon as well. So that's just a quick listing of what I think some of the strengths and weaknesses of the national approach have been. But it's also true from a central point of view, or from a public policy point of view, that there are a lot of questions about the way institutions themselves might be bootstrapping their efforts as times change and as the way that we conduct research needs to change. So I thought of a quick list of things that an institution might ask itself about where it's up to in eResearch. And I have done this from a university point of view, but you could ask the same questions in other publicly funded research institutions. Is there an absolutely top-level plan of the university where you actually get the word or its equivalent? Has someone been designated to direct the effort? Is there some kind of support unit that you can identify for this area of work? And more particularly, have you got a reasonable alignment and working together of the research management function, postgraduate training responsibilities of the institution, and technology support and library units? In fact, the answer to question 3 and 4 can be quite bound up together. And from the institution's point of view, looking out, is the most being made of the regional, national, and in some cases transnational collaborations that are on offer? And I could think of institutions in my own state where the answer to that last question can be variable. So I think if you get a score of 3 or 4 out of 5 there, then probably the right sorts of things are happening. And finally, I think a reasonable interim conclusion about where we are in 2012 is that Australia has done a lot to enhance its national capability. Some of the things that you hear at this conference are such clear evidence about that, about the differences that have been made by some of the eResearch investments that have been overseen and implemented in the way that I've just described. And secondly, that despite all of the wrinkles, there is a reasonable level of national coherence in what we're doing. And thirdly, and unsurprisingly, there's not quite the green tick for national sustainability, although I hope that when we look back from 2020, 2025, we will see that one way or another our funding cycles did lead to the further support and development and therefore the sustainability of the capability and coherence that we've developed so far. So, thank you for listening.
Thanks, Tom. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today as part of this forum. I guess when Reese, Tom, and I discussed the format for the forum today, we thought that there might be some linkages between our presentation in meeting the theme, the future for Australian eResearch infrastructure. And in fact, there are some common themes between my talk and Tom's, which are almost purely coincidental, but of course we've been thinking about the same things over the same sort of period of time. Tom, in addition to being the chair of the Australian eResearch Infrastructure Council, was also a member of the National Research Infrastructure Council, which was the body that we set up to oversee the implementation of all our NCRIS and SuperScience investments in the last little while. So Tom has got, a good understanding of research infrastructure implementation overall. And from my end, I've not only worked in eResearch, but I've also worked in marine and climate research infrastructure and had a fairly strong hand in the development of the 2008 and 2011 strategic roadmaps for Australian research infrastructure. So between us, I think we have a fairly good understanding of this space. So yesterday, you may have had the opportunity of hearing my acting head of division, which is the Science and Research Division in the department, speaking about the work that the department is doing in leading planning for a future for researchers. Catherine referred to the work of the Australian Research Committee, or ARCOM, in developing a national research investment plan that takes a holistic approach to funding all aspects of the research system, including research infrastructure. And I hope that you did have an opportunity to be there, because I do want to follow on from some of her statements and give you a further sense of what the department is doing as we move towards a refreshed environment for the activity that we fund and engage in. And I also want to give you a sense of the environment that the Australian eResearch Infrastructure Council is leaving us with. After 5 years of guiding investments and advising the government in this space. So you know now, if you did not know before, that the main body that the Australian government set up to advise it on eResearch infrastructure investments in 2007, the Australian eResearch Infrastructure Council, is being concluded by the department in February 2013. And here I'd like to take an opportunity on behalf of the department to very much thank all the members of the council, and we have 3 members with us today. In fact, we have quite a few members with us today. I think we've got Paul Sherlock here in the front row. He's also a member of ERIC. For the work that they've done over the last few years, since 2007, in guiding and helping us with the implementation of our investments. And I'd like to thank Tom particularly for his leadership of the council, and Reese for his expert guidance of us through these times, and particularly his work on a day-by-day basis with the department, which has been greatly appreciated. So returning to where I was before, concurrent to the conclusion of the Australian eResearch Infrastructure Council, the new Australian Research Committee, or ARCOM, that the Minister for Tertiary Education, Skills, Science and Research, Senator Chris Evans, set up at the beginning of this year, is working to develop advice to the government on a holistic approach to research funding that encompasses all aspects of the research system. And the work that ARCOM is doing does build on and takes into account previous work by the department in identifying priorities for research infrastructure and e-research infrastructure through the 2011 Strategic Roadmap for Australian Research Infrastructure. Much of what you and other stakeholders of ours, as well as ERIC itself, injected into the roadmap process last year to help us identify priorities for e-research infrastructure is still actively under consideration as ARCOM and the department take their work forward. You might recall that the roadmap discussed what factors were essential to the successful delivery of e-research infrastructure, and Tom has already referred to some of them. These included such aspects as having the appropriate skills and people, ensuring that resources for whole of delivery approaches, including for operating the infrastructure, are available, and ensuring that appropriate governance is in place, and so on. These are aspects that are vital to the rest of the research system as well, and ARCOM will develop the appropriate approaches for considering these facets in any scenario that involves funding for research, including for research infrastructure. Okay, so from the perspective of those of us in the department who care about e-research, we find ourselves in an interesting period. Those of you who heard me talk at this forum last year would recall that I spoke extensively about the 2011 roadmap and the priorities it had identified for future e-research infrastructure investment. However, and Catherine referred to this yesterday in her opening address, however, in this fiscal environment, the government has not yet committed to funding for a future research infrastructure program. And I know that there are questions that have been raised in the questions that were sent to the organizers for this forum today about funding for future e-research infrastructure, and I propose to answer them in the next few minutes. The department itself remains as committed, however, to promoting the value of research infrastructure and promoting the need for continued funding in this space. And those of you who have worked with us for a while, who have worked with our department for a while, would know, I think, I hope, how committed we have been in our intentions in relation to research infrastructure. I do think, it is important to realize that, in fact, the bureaucracy does work very hard on your behalf, in terms of trying to enable a continuation of the research infrastructure space. So while we are yet to secure funding for a successor program to SubScience and NCRIS, we are operating on the assumption that funding will come into play at some point in the future. Meanwhile, we continue to implement live SubScience projects with much of the infrastructure about to come online in the next year, and I think Reese is going to talk about that a bit more in his presentation. So we do have the time to both consolidate and plan for future funding. And this, I have to say, is a good thing. Most people who benefit from the investments in new research infrastructure through the government SubScience program appreciate the amount of funds, $312 million out of a total of $1.1 billion, that flowed and are still flowing into the research sector as a result of SubScience. The nature of the funding, however, did mean that we had to act quickly to implement the projects. SubScience was created in a period where economic stimulus was seen as vital to the Australian economy as a response to the global financial crisis. Therefore, while we were clear on the priorities and the strategic injection that was needed, and while we were very much able to build on existing investments, such as in high-performance computing, in data management, and in high-capacity research networks, we would certainly have profited from a longer lead-up in terms of planning for SubScience. And I say this in the knowledge that the implementation of some of our newer research infrastructure investments in collaboration tools and resources through the Nectar project and in data storage through the RDSI project have not been without their challenges. We did not have with SubScience the opportunity we had under NCRIS to seek investment plans collaboratively developed for each of our projects over a significant period of time. And that was a particular challenge that we had to meet in terms of super science. And I'm sure that some of the lead agents, and of course Tom has talked about lead agents, some of the lead agents that we have appointed for some of our newer projects would have appreciated a greater level of understanding and detail around not just what infrastructure was to be invested in, but how it was to be implemented. So some of the bedding down we are doing now, some of the reorganization of our thoughts, and continued consultation with the sector as Outcome is doing, all contribute towards having a more thorough sense of how we can better implement any future investment. And this consolidation and planning may well re-examine some of the paradigms for collaboration that we have been working with, such as, indeed, how does the model of a lead agent taking forward a collaboration best operate with the sector? I'd like to note that this planning by Outcome and the department is not only happening at the conceptual or a broad level. We are also specifically looking at the issue of data, that is, research data and data for research as a challenge to resolve into the future. The 2011 roadmap found that the expected growth in both the complexity and volume of data for research would bring particular challenges around data management and handling. For example, how in real terms will we handle the volumes of data emanating from the square kilometer array? How will we share that data? What access policies fit best for what circumstances? How do we encompass the need for researchers to have access to data not generated within the research sector? These are questions that are gaining prominence, not only in the research sector, but elsewhere, and not only in Australia, but overseas. And they are questions to which we can better provide answers as a result of our experience of NCRIS and super science. So recognizing the role that data is playing and the issues to be resolved, the department has recently set up a committee to examine how best to implement research data infrastructures into the future. By research data infrastructures, we mean not only those research infrastructures that deal with data, but also those research infrastructures that are data intensive by virtue of the amount and complexity of the data that they generate or handle. So the Research Data Infrastructure Committee, chaired by Dr. Ron Sandlin, comprises a range of key stakeholders who lead or rely on NCRIS and super science research data infrastructures, such as the Integrated Marine Observing System or the Population Health Research Network. And these stakeholders include representatives of other government agencies, such as the Bureau of Meteorology and Geoscience Australia. The committee is examining a range of issues and mechanisms to better enable use of data into the future, and is expected to deliver a report to the department by April 2013 that will be considered as part of the ongoing work of Outcome. I would like to reflect now on, thank you, thank you. I would like to reflect now on where I think the environment is as ERIC comes to an end, and as we begin our new planning processes for the future. So as we continue to plan for the future and make the best use of the time that we have available before the next round of funding, we realize that things have moved on since our first investments in this space. NCRIS and super science have placed a very strong emphasis on collaboration and the value of collaboration in increasing the cost effectiveness and relevance of our investments. And despite the fact that collaboration is not easy, I think that we have proven that it is possible. I do think that in this respect, Rhys Francis has played a particular role as broker, as advisor, as friend, as a key person who has linked up key people in the sector in order to enable our investments in this space. So thank you very much, Rhys, in particular. Stakeholders across our investments, I do think, talk far more frequently with each other than they did previously, and at a deeper level than they did previously, sharing lessons and benefits. Developers and leaders of our infrastructure are met with open arms, or less than closed arms perhaps, in arenas outside the traditional eResearch arena, because people understand the collaborative basis on which super science and NCRIS investments operate. Co-investment into our projects has been significant as a result. Your participation in or leadership of an eResearch infrastructure project funded under NCRIS or SubScience means that you are taken seriously and that discussions around how to optimize infrastructure occur more easily, which has flow-on benefits for those researchers seeking to use the infrastructure. We have also learned how to face barriers to collaboration and how to make collaboration mean something. I do hasten to add that in this respect, we are still learning, because each project or new initiative requires working out the best and most productive way of working together to capitalize on the investment being made. In addition to better understanding how to collaborate, I think we do better understand some of the factors in balancing strategic investment. For instance, where it is necessary to make a single large capital investment, such as in high-performance computing, versus where it is helpful for the future to invest in small experimental capabilities, such as the Nectar, research tools, and virtual laboratories. I do feel that the department's conversation with both developers and users of eResearch infrastructure now begin at a different, more sophisticated level than occurred 5 years ago. And there is far more acknowledgement in the sector of the need to invest in eResearch and eResearch infrastructure, not just as a single underpinning level, but as an integral part of research capabilities. And I would dare to suggest, in response to Tom, that institutions now have a more fine-tuned perception of the important role they play, not only as co-investors, in relation to some of the national eResearch infrastructure investments. But this is something that we do need to continue to work on, finding that ideal balance between catering for the needs of the institutions versus the national, more systemic needs. So what does this leave you with? ERIC is coming to an end, but in no way is the department taking a sabbatical from the space. We have built relationships in the sector that will continue through mechanisms such as RCOM and the Research Data Infrastructure Committee. We have in place and will continue to promote investment processes and governance structures that favor collaboration for a range of reasons, including the fiscal pressures. We have reached a maturity of investments, which means that implementation can be tailored much more closely to the needs of the users, that potential co-investors realize much more potently the importance of their contributions, and that the next generation of researchers will be able to better harness all the possibilities that eResearch infrastructure offers. And in presenting the prize that we referred to earlier to our prize winner, we do hope that our prize winner will be able to talk to you more about the possibilities that eResearch brings. So you can rest assured that we will continue to work with the sector and with you, whether it be at the strategic direction level or at the depths of implementation and design, to ensure that the investments we are making have as much impact as they can for you and future generations. And we will continue to work with you to enable a future beyond NCRIS and SubScience. Thank you for your time today.
So, welcome to the final ARIC Forum. Right, so we finally got a picture that makes some sense about what we talk about finally at the end, at last. So I'm going to give an overview of what's actually going on and what you can expect to be part of for the next few years. As Tom said, we actually have a definition. It arose because someone asked the question, well, if you went around the council and asked what is eResearch infrastructure, you would get 13 different answers, and perhaps you should get one answer. So that's the answer. What does it mean? Well, it's a cornerstone of modern research. We advance the frontiers of research in ways that wouldn't be possible, but we actually know what we mean when we say that. We have the way to manipulate data at scales that weren't possible before. We can generate new insights through modelling and computing and analysis that aren't able to be found any other way. And we can work together in teams around the world that just wouldn't be possible without this infrastructure. So that's what we're trying to do. Why does the government care? Well, it turns out the big problems are getting harder and more complex. And no one discipline answers ageing, answers energy. So if we're going to tackle these big problems, we actually need to work more efficiently and effectively across a range of disciplines and integrate all of that stuff somehow to address these questions. And so we must be able to do this. So that is why governments invest in the e-infrastructure that underpins research, to get those kinds of gains. And what we need, well, we have to be urgent. We have to deal with problems quickly, We have bushfires. We have to respond to them. We need systems that can do that, that can analyse what's going on, and so on. We need to be able to predict better what is going to happen, because accidental development is actually not in our interest anymore. We have competition in the global context. We invest in this infrastructure because if we don't, we will become a second-class country if we lose our innovation and research capabilities. So that's the kind of motivation that leads to the kind of funding that we actually get. So what are we actually doing? That's the diagram we use to depict what we're doing. We actually have considered what we need. We need better bandwidth, we need better modelling, we need larger data collections, we need shared access methods, we need a research data commons, and above that, we need problem-oriented digital laboratories. And when you look at that diagram, you can say, well, some of the funding is capability, and some of the funding is integration with research. And we have a push and a pull. And the thing about eResearch infrastructure is you've got to walk up the stairs with both feet. So you have to have the demand and you have to have the supply, and they really have to go together somehow. So that's how we do it. And in fact, every one of those functions has been implemented as an investment. Now that is good because we know what we're trying to achieve, but it's difficult for our researchers because they actually want all of those functions. And so one of the comments we often get is it's actually a little bit too complex to figure out the pathway through the maze of all those functions to do my research. And as I come to the end of my talk, I'll talk a bit more about that. I thought I'd just give a little bit of the history, just the timeline, so you can see that you are part of something that has been coming for a long time. So INCRIS was way back in 2005. We had the platforms for collaboration, consultation. We started the Australian National Data Service. It was the first one in the world, I guess, of such an investment. Then super science happened. Now, every one of those little boxes at the bottom is a $50 million or so investment. Now, if we were in the US, that would have to be $500 million to have the same impact on the US system that 50 million has on the Australian system. They are, in fact, very large investments in the Australian context. And every single one of those, a lead agent had to be found, a project plan had to be developed, and the people involved had to be appointed, and then we all kind of had to agree on what we're actually going to do. So that was the process. That is what ARIC has been doing. The result of that is all of this stuff over on the right-hand side of that diagram, I guess. So we have an access federation, we're extending the research network, we're putting in petascale computing systems we haven't had before, new research tools, new workflows, new cloud systems, new storage systems, and so on. And where we are is about there. It actually hasn't happened yet. So all of that implementation, all of that planning, in fact, delivery is next year. We will deliver about $200 million worth of infrastructure into the research sector next year. And despite all the different projects, it's kind of coordinated in a way where you actually do need data, you do need networks, you do need computing, you do need them all to happen at once, and they are actually all going to arrive at once. You have 3 or 4 years of use of this infrastructure, and your goal is to maximise the research benefits of that infrastructure. But that's where we are. And you can see why the Council concludes that, in fact, from the top, all decisions have now been made. We're just finalising the RDSI storage REDS process. We'll do that this year. Nectar's committed all of the funds it has to tools and virtual labs and the cloud nodes. We've made all the top-level decisions. So, in fact, the Council concludes with job finished. So that is why it concludes. The way I like to look at this is eResearch infrastructure is simple to understand. It's tools, data, compute and networks delivered to you, a researcher, on your desktop so you can do what you want to do. Behind that, there's supercomputers, there's data stores, there's a cloud, there's tools, there's people, there's real buildings, there's real big buildings. We should go and see the NCI facility. It's just an amazing thing, and Pawsey will be the same. And why do we do that? So that our researchers can model things that they couldn't see or understand otherwise. So they can work together in groups and collaborate around the world in ways they couldn't otherwise. So that they can see into data in ways that you can't see without the computer to analyse that data. That is why we do it. so we can understand mechanisms we want to understand, so we can undertake novel research, so we can do new things, solve new problems, and we can generate new theories. That's eResearch infrastructure. That's the picture. We do that. But that is the picture. The projects are about that. Next time, a year from now, where will we be? We'll be up to 100 gigabits on our network sometime next year, probably. We'll have more than one layer at 100 gigabits, so it's a massive injection upwards in bandwidth. We have single sign-on. Please, let's have single sign-on. Common access, I've been saying this for 7 years. No? High reliance service will exist. In fact, they already exist. We'll have 2 new world-class data centres, 2.5 petaflops of supercomputing in them, new data products generated by those computers, so processing data for researchers to use, and the co-location of data and compute and cloud resources will be in place next year. Data publication will be delivered, be possible. We'll have 8 high-scaled storage services shared by every institution in the sector. We'll have about 50 petabytes of data in those data stores and another 50 to come in 2014. If you want to read that. And for the first time, it's true now, Australian data will be discoverable. It will be possible. There are 41,000 collections in the Research Data Commons now. Hundreds of shared research tools and applications developed in the cloud, shared in the cloud. It's a new paradigm for actually doing tools in research. Developed for and in use by many researchers, we'll have about half a petaflop of computing capability in the cloud infrastructure itself, and we'll have labs using digital flows, data flows. That is what is going to happen in 2013, next year. And the researcher will have what they want on their desktop. That's the goal. The way it's going to look when it's built is like that. So, a big red pipe, which is, huge data flows around nodes, 8 shared data services around the country. It's hard to get less than 1 per state because state governments have money and we kind of think that's interesting. Typically state money doesn't flow across state boundaries very easily, if ever. And the idea that a state would fund some other state to store its data is a concept that's too far away. That's a big leap for anyone to even imagine would happen, so it's hard to get less than 1 per state. But 52, every university, CSIRO, all the publicly funded research agencies are involved in a single common national data infrastructure. And in those nodes is where the computing resources go. So the supercomputers and the cloud nodes are in those data centres. They are next to each other. And above that we have the Research Data Commons and software tools and laboratories. There's more than 250 data improvement projects in progress at the moment. Single sign-on, please. All researchers can get to their results. We have to have single sign-on or workflow can't happen. You can't workflow things if you don't have single sign-on. So that is the physical delivery of the infrastructure. It is actually a very well-coordinated outcome of a whole range of different projects and project teams and governance structures making appropriate decisions at appropriate times. What's going to come next? What do we now know that we didn't know 7 years ago? So I went back to 2007. This was the original concept. This diagram wasn't used because it was thought to be too complicated. What it says is, look, we have some foundation services, networks, access federations and so on, things where one is enough. One is needed and one is enough. Then we have data and we have data experts, and we have compute experts. We have a horrible problem in the middle, so how do we make all that work together? That's the one with the big red box around it that says this is a problem. But the key of this diagram is the purpose of what we're doing is that we actually want people who aren't experts to receive the benefit of the capabilities that we're building. And that comes down to the tools at the top. So that diagram was too complicated, and we actually came up with a simpler diagram which just said there's 4 things. But if we were to draw that diagram now, it would look like that. Now you could say it hasn't got simpler, right? But it has. We actually understand this incredibly well, and what's on that diagram is the actual investments. So in fact we've gone from a theory to a reality. So we have these data infrastructures like Orion and Turn. And the key question is, do they need their own hardware or should they use the cloud? And what is the answer? They should use the cloud. We have cloud services, one per state, coming into existence. We have data services, one per state, coming into existence. And at the bottom we have our foundation services, where one is enough. And we have the questions. Can these things share services? Now, your answer is yes. The days have passed where to start Turn, the first question should be, what servers will we buy and who will own them and where will they go? We never want that question asked again. We want the layer at the top to be about models, about tools, about knowledge and expertise, and about people. They are the value growth assets. We want the investment at the top in the appreciating assets. Everything below there is a cost. It's a depreciating asset that you actually throw away and replace. It's consumable. The beauty to me in the cloud is, for the first time ever, it's possible to fund research infrastructure from a business as usual budget line. So the challenge in the past is what every researcher wants is different. So from an IT director's point of view, it's a nightmare. You can't support all these different tools. You can't provide, the point of IT is to standardise at the corporate delivery level. But cloud changes that. Cloud says, well, we can run big back-end services with real IT people doing real IT stuff, and researchers don't do it anymore. And we virtualise across the top of that, and then it's all very special above that. So for the first time ever, we can ask Paul and his friends, can business as usual be directed to support cloud infrastructure for research, is the coming question. And down at the bottom, we keep running into one problem, which is we don't have the operators for the core services that we need, because no institution is an operator. Universities are not funded to provide services to each other. They're funded to compete for better research. So, where are the operators of those core services? And what I've found over the last few years is the interesting thing about super science was that you had to mix funding. So at the top of this diagram, we actually have competitive funding, competitive advantage research funding. The reason to be involved is for you to get ahead. That is the reason to be involved. At the bottom, we have national capability funding, which is really national competitive funding. How do we compete in the world environment? And what we have to do as we put these infrastructures together is we have to mix those fundings. It has to be okay for the researchers to win. So you have a conversation about open source. I don't actually share that view. I think that the people who develop software should have the first use, and then it should become open source. We have to deliver a competitive gain to the people who invest in the activities and the infrastructure for some return on that investment. We have to find ways to do that. So that's, to me, we are now in a position where we can connect all of the dots. And we have an infrastructure that's coming that is a layered infrastructure across the country for research in which every institution participates. So that is the great achievement of ARIC, I guess. So that's my talk, and we're open for questions. So the key messages are, remember, it's research at the top. It's a national infrastructure. It goes to the desktop, to the researcher the way they want it, and it's open for business. We are going to install it now. The supercomputers will be available first quarter. The cloud nodes, one exists, more will come. The data stores will all be up and running first half of next year. You are going to be part of a massive change across the way e-infrastructure impacts research. So my closing remark is I'd just like to thank you, and thank you. You know, the vendors tell us this conference is a buzz. This conference is a buzz. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very inspiring from our three speakers. Now we're going to open the floor for questions. We have two mics up on the first level near the stairwell, and we have a roving mic here on the ground level. While you begin to think of your questions, we've actually received questions through the email this morning, so I'm just going to open the session with one question that came in around virtual laboratories, and I'm going to hand this over to Reese. So Reese, virtual laboratories are a new way of funding eResearch infrastructure tailored to the domains of research, and our experience, as the person says, our experience has been very positive. A successful virtual lab project enables greater collaboration and research output. So the question is, are there plans for additional funding for the development of existing or new virtual labs? Or Cheryl, maybe.
Well,
It's on? No, it's not? Oh, yes, it is. Okay, well, whoever wrote that question, they are right. A successful virtual lab project should enable greater collaboration and research outputs. And in fact, that is, the aim of virtual labs. I guess when we embarked on the Nectar project and we, included the concept of virtual labs in the Nectar project, we did hope to bring a new paradigm for research into the future by, bringing into play the capability for people to work, for researchers to work with a range of tools in one single environment, and to sort of benefit from all the gains that cohesion of experience can provide. So the person who provided this question suggested that it's been a very positive experience so far. We would be interested as the virtual labs are rolled out, and Glenn is just in the second row there looking at me. We are very interested in knowing, in fact, how the progress and development of virtual labs occur, and how useful they do in fact prove to be for the research community, by particular discipline or as a whole. So if there are, I guess, good arguments for continuing the virtual labs into the future, then yes, it certainly would be under consideration for future eResearch infrastructure investments. I would just note, however, that of course with the pace of technological change, anything could happen to override virtual labs as a concept. So it may well be that there are other considerations, better, more advanced considerations by the time we come to funding.
If I could. Yes. Thank you. Are you awake? Yes. So the interesting thing about virtual labs is I know what was intended when the plan was written, and it didn't turn out that way. It turned out better. So the interesting thing is that the concept grew out of the grid. So when we planned Nectar, we elevated from interoperation and systems talking to each other in a grid world to a user experience, which we described as virtual labs. And what struck me was in that process, it was very clear that out there were ideas about what virtual labs are. And so the plan was written extremely openly, just say, look, there's something we need to do. We called it virtual labs. Glenn ran a process that specified roughly what they would be. They've got to connect resources. They've got to do things that you can't do across individual resources and so on. And the interest level has been outstanding, just outstanding. So there's something about the moment. There's something about the moment that virtual labs fit. But they grew out of the grid. We actually don't have a national grid in Australia. I remember I went to see Ian Foster and said, we're going to turn the grid off, Ian, is that bad? He said, okay, well, we can live with that. But we have a cloud. And in many ways, that is the experience that researchers really want. They actually want their virtualised resources. So I think the best answer to this question is that the way the planning happens means that what's needed can emerge. And virtual labs emerged from the planning process as a need. And when we invited applications, we were kind of out. It was just an extraordinary response. And some of the virtual labs, you'll see the talks in the conference, are just amazing. But that's the advantage of the integrated planning process with the sector. So if they're valuable, yes, is the answer to the question.
Okay. Are there other questions on the floor?
Hello.
If you could identify yourself too, thanks.
I'm Mike Pheasant from the Genomics Virtual Laboratory, so I asked the question. And I guess to me the labs are popular because the researchers are identified directly as the beneficiaries, and we're talking about what the researchers need to do their work, rather than what storage do you need, what compute do you need, or do you need both connected to each other, for example. So I think it met the researchers' needs, and we're looking at the end of development is the end of next year, so our lab won't have any development funding going forward.
So, I mean, the future funding question is just a future question. I think we'll find that the level of interest in the labs themselves will be high enough to sustain them. They're just extraordinary value adds to the system. So we can't really comment on what the funding solution will be, but there's every expectation that at some point in the future there will be funding. I can't imagine virtual labs not being part of a program, but, you know, they need to deliver.
Okay. If I may, Joanne, follow on from that. I think Rhys is right in saying that the funding is a future issue that we need to deal with. I guess if you talk about funding, I would like to emphasise that funding is not simply within the purview of the Australian government. Funding is also, or support for virtual labs and continued, support for virtual labs is also at the discretion of the participants in those virtual labs. And we have seen significant co-investment in both NCRIS and SubScience. So we cannot take the full credit for funding the system.
Are you having fun?
There's a gentleman here with a question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you all for a really nice set of presentations. Clearly, Australia is doing a number of things that we're not in the U.S., and maybe we should be considering them. But one of the things that challenges us as well as you is, what are the metrics that you use to evaluate the effectiveness of these investments?
Well, so we have long discussions late into the night on that. We do, and I don't know that we have metrics. We have KPIs in our projects, but they're more delivery than impact. And our problem with some of the data infrastructures is the timeline for the impact is, 10 years. So I think it's not that we don't know what we're doing, and it's not that we can't measure it. It's just that the research impact is a long way past the actual point of infrastructure creation. So we'd like to talk to you about that. We don't know the answers.
Can I just add one more point there, which is that there is, of course, the wider question, which is how do we evaluate research, full stop? And there's a huge international discussion about that. One of the things that's very topical in Australia at the moment is the notion of measuring impact as distinct from quality, where quality is understood to be something that has reference to scholarly citation rates and so on. It's possible for institutions to actually track some of their research outputs and consider how many of them were actually made possible by dependence on this kind of infrastructure, and that's certainly happened in my institution. But in terms of an overall answer, it's as Rhys said, I think.
Okay, thank you. I might just ask one question that came in this morning, and then we'll take the question over there. So this question, I think I'll direct to Tom. Tom, it's actually about legacy data and legacy material. Given the acceleration in the production of and use of scholarly data, e-publications and e-journals as a result of ready availability in digital format, what impact do you think this will have? What approach do you think needs to be taken here in Australia to help with the unlocking this content? What examples are there that this is cost effective, and what impact do you think it will have on Australian research?
Thank you very much, Joanne. I think others might have something to say as well. Part of the question is about all of the material we have to date, which is actually still locked up because it's physically bound, as it were. It's still in physical format. And one of the things that is true and I think also this is true everywhere, is that opportunities that we thought that might have been exploited quite a long time ago for national digitisation programs for all of the material that we have in our research institutions just didn't come along in the way that we imagined they might. And that's in every jurisdiction. There have been some landmark projects, but they have not occurred. In Australia at the moment, there's quite a crucial process that I think everyone who attends this conference and is considering these sorts of things into the future should be aware of. And that is the current reference to the Australian Law Reform Commission on copyright exceptions, which quite explicitly refers to the question of obstacles to mass digitisation programs in which institutions might engage, cultural institutions, collecting institutions and so on. And that in itself is a worthy goal. It has come up for public policy discussion in Australia, but it has not been resolved so far. And that's, I think, a point that should be made as that commission goes on. It's not due to report until November 2013, and certainly public submission to the discussion paper should reference that. The other thing that I think must be mentioned, and it came up in a discussion, or it potentially came up as one of the points in an earlier paper that I was at, which was really about the relationship between citizens and science, public access to our research outputs. And that is, when you think about the advances that Australia has made in the way that Reece just depicted in the last 20 minutes or so, it is absolutely astonishing that we have not gone further in making the results of our quality certified research, our research outputs as published in the journal literature, more accessible through a more determined policy of open access to research outputs. And if we did that, and furthermore, if we do it in a way which allows for future reuse, then we will greatly assist with taking down another barrier to greater interaction between researchers, their outputs, and the future users of that. So I think if those two things, which are quite easily described, policy agendas, were to resolve more rapidly than they are at the moment, we go a long way to a greater acceleration in this.
Sure.
If I could continue on from that, I guess from the funders' or potential funders' perspective, the question here is, what approach do you think needs to be taken? Well, I think it is very important to be able to work out some way of prioritizing what needs to be digitized in the future, because evidently we cannot digitize everything. And we need to really work out and understand the value of digitizing certain objects or collections, and what the potential impact that might have on research now and into the future, which is often hard to understand because you never quite know when a particular thing that was collected in the past, whether it's a rock or it's a print newspaper article or anything else, might be useful into the future. But we do need to work out what priorities we have around digitization. I should also note that from the department's perspective, digitization is not necessarily the purview of eResearch. We do consider it as a capability in its own right. And those of you who've read the 2011 roadmap would have seen that we put digitization, in as a separate chapter, preceding the eResearch infrastructure chapter. But there are obviously key linkages between digitization and eResearch infrastructure. For instance, you need to have the right standards for digital records, for the creation of digital records. And you do need to work out what technology is needed as the infrastructure that is needed to underpin digitization. So those are some of the approaches that I think need to be taken.
I just want to make a short comment, certainly from my own experience working in national collections, that if we had started to digitise some of this material in biological collections a decade ago, we would have done it in a very expensive, laborious way. And I think what we're beginning to see is some new technologies coming along, people having new methods actually of digitising this material much more efficiently and cost effectively. So I think having a pause has actually been quite good in an investment sense. Now there is a question here, please.
Thank you. I'm Graham Cameron, ex-European Bioinformatics Institute, now University of Queensland. I fully understand, well, from my experience, the difficulty of research funding in terms of long-term commitments, and that funding has to be kind of project-based and episodic, and we understand, and you know, statements that the intent is there to keep these capabilities going are, of course, reassuring. There's an issue that needs to be understood that's associated with not just that as an intent, but also the impact on these kind of infrastructure activities that I've seen over the years, and that is that for this to really succeed, people need to be able to build careers as information engineers. And there is a real problem when the funding is fragile and people are typically working in academic institutions, that their concern is to protect their employability within the conventional academic career structure. And we must recognize that there is a kind of skill that is different. They're not necessarily the same kind of people. And it's not any less smart than doing real research, in the sense that a guy who builds a microscope might be just as skillful as the guy who runs the microscope, but it's a different kind of motivation, and it's important to this that we recognize that.
I'll comment. Okay, so look, so I think this has come up in every roadmap and every review, and one of our problems is for institutions to create classes of jobs that those skills fit into. And the career structures just aren't in existence at an institutional level, so it's really, really hard to deal with. But there's kind of the skill to operate the infrastructure. There's also the skill to integrate it into the research. And that is kind of a very unique skill, and those people are immensely valuable. But again, we don't have a career structure for that class of activity. So this has been recognised repeatedly. I don't know that there's a process in train to deal with it, but it's even in the most recent workforce report.
Just briefly, before Tom makes his remarks, ARCOM, the Australian Research Committee that I mentioned earlier, is considering a whole range of issues, including skills, and is building on some of the findings of the research workforce strategy that was released last year, as well as some of the remarks in the roadmap about the need for career paths and having the right people and the right skills in the system in order to enable our research infrastructure. And as Reese mentioned, it is a vexed question. It is actually difficult, within our current structures to be able to enable those career paths. But we will continue to try and work towards some resolution.
My only additional comment is that some of the questions about recognising new skills are not new, and they relate also to the question of rewarding different kinds of behaviour, which will give us different outcomes with data. And it's a really old question. But we don't seem to see the adaptation to those new requirements that we need in thinking about workforces in research institutions occurring, and it's just getting more urgent.
We'll take a question here, but I'll first of all ask a question from the email. So you might want to give the gentleman the microphone so he's ready. Reese, I'll just direct it to you because I think it'll be a fairly short answer. You talked about the alphabet soup, all those building blocks this is question 5, the building blocks that make up the eResearch infrastructure. And the question is there a process to maintain an overarching view of these projects so that they will all eventually integrate to provide a truly useful platform for research?
So I think we're in a transition between a kind of functional investment mode, and I've shown the projects, but we notice that they're all actually being delivered through common delivery points, and the integration will absolutely occur at those delivery points. And I think researchers say, well, we don't really want to apply for supercomputing, then apply for storage, then apply for cloud, then get involved in a VL and then do something with it. We don't want to do that. And so I think the one thing we're missing is a common resource allocation process, but that doesn't actually need a structure, it just needs the participant projects to work together. And so I think it's a demand that can't be ignored, and so I know some of the projects are going to say, well, if they allocate this, we won't review it, we'll just co-allocate our resource. But I think a more coherent statement to researchers would be highly welcomed. But I think that's about the only thing that needs to happen, because the delivery, we will have the compute, the data and the networks connected all into the one groups, and they're entities that have all of those functions now.
Okay, thank you. I might take a question here.
Nathan Bindoff. My question is quite simple. We've talked about impact, and one of the impacts in the preamble from Tom was about the economy. So the question is how to actually create the pathway between all this wonderful research structure and research services to actually deliver impacts directly into the economy. So this is the relationship between innovation that's got commercial purpose and also purpose around policy built on aspects of the research infrastructures being created.
Well, I think our recent experience is that we're being overwhelmed by agencies who think that that already should have happened. And they see data as one of the key... We've created data infrastructures that have value beyond research. And one of the emerging discussions we're going to have is how do we share, how do we cooperate infrastructure with operational agencies, because in fact data is going to be somewhere, and where that data is going to be used for lots of different things. So I think we're increasingly unable to isolate ourselves. So it's almost like we're going down a track where the joining at the hip between research and the rest of the world is going to happen, because the content and the tools are going to be the pathways. Right? They're going to be the pathways. So I don't know whether I really answered the question, but to me, a really big challenge is, what's fit for purpose for research, what's fit for purpose for industry, what's fit for purpose for policy, and how do we merge all of those into one framework?
Well, I think you've exactly answered the question, Rhys, and it's a massive convergence. The full effect we can't see. I think the critical question is how well we guide it. With policy, with institutional response, with a whole range of things.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Anne Cregan from Intersect. The infrastructure that's being developed is making fantastic leaps in terms of what a researcher can do with a machine, and also on the machine-to-machine layer. But what hasn't been addressed explicitly is person-to-person collaboration, especially real-time collaboration. And on that layer, we're seeing things like video conferencing not being explicitly supported anymore. And I'm just interested to know what the panel think about person-to-person communication as enabled by this infrastructure. Is the idea that the virtual labs will support it, or what are the plans for that?
I have a personal opinion about that, which is social technologies are going to be supplied, and we should just buy them. We should just buy them. So one of the issues we've got is that in research we used to lead the IT application space, internet, web, all this kind of stuff. Well, the rest of the world's gone past us at a huge speed, and that's great, because that means we don't need to do it. So the problem we have always had with video collaboration is because you don't control the endpoints, it almost always doesn't work. But if you buy an iPhone, you can do video calls on it because the endpoint's completely controlled by the supplier. So I think that's what we should do. We should just go commercial on the human-to-human collaboration, because in fact the rest of the world already has. Well, come on. This is not the only money in the world, right? Everybody spends money on data. Everybody spends money on computing. Everybody spends money on communications. Good.
I think we could say that we have spent some money in the past, because we certainly have put in place a national research network that enables such collaboration to occur, and without it, you won't be able to use those social media devices that Rhys is referring to. And I do agree with Reece that it is difficult if you actually do build your access grid rooms or, your video conferencing services within your organization. The problem is that there are so many different solutions out there that actually integrating those solutions can be an issue. And it may well be that the social media devices are the way to the future. And it may, in fact, be a simple solution than we've ever encountered before. So there is a matter of waiting for things to happen and for evolution to occur before you can actually get to the point to be able, of being able to really optimize your use of these kinds of, interactions. And we certainly do promote person-to-person collaboration and interactions in the research sector, very much so.
So another of the investments is in biosecurity, which has a collaboration solution, but it's Adobe Connect, provided as a service. And it kind of works well, but now that it works on an iPad, it works really well. Because the endpoint's completely defined. And so you get away from my laptops. I have trouble because I move it everywhere and plug it into all kinds of things. And I kill every video conference I'm in. Right? But an iPad, you just take out your iPad, you go Adobe Connect, and it works.
Thank you. I might ask one of the other questions from the ones that were sent in. It's to do with our international connections. So it starts off, given the presence of New Zealanders at this conference and the high level of collaboration across the Tasman, that people are interested in, and also the Australian government's white paper that was released this week or last week, what efforts to date and ongoing need it needs to be undertaken to support collaborative e-research both across the Tasman and also into the Asian region? What are the challenges in the approach to supporting international collaboration? How might some of the investment in e-research infrastructure meet these challenges? And what examples are there in the Australian e-research landscape that already provide evidence of cost-benefit analysis of doing this? So it's really about, we've kind of worked out the problem, the solution for Australia. The world's next. So Reece, do you want to, you have some thoughts about this?
Where is he? Nick, where are you? So I was over in New Zealand last week. Obviously there's an issue about money changing countries, right? But if we ignore that, we work quite well with the New Zealand chaps, and they're part of the AAF. In fact, we're happy to help them set up their own access federation. We had a common grid. I think they're usually engaged in many of our conversations, but there is just this issue of money changing countries. So it needs to be both investing in something that they see an advantage to.
Yes, I think just taking that one step further, if there were if the economic relationship was even stronger, that facilitated those sorts of flows without the constant question, well, what's in this for us, in either direction, then that would be an obvious big change. I have known Australia-New Zealand collaborations in the area of development of systems, and I mean IT systems, to fail for reasons that were unclear but seemed to be to do with sovereignty. That's 20 years ago. I hope we're past that. But and one way to steadily chip away at it is to make sure that we develop collaborations at a more pragmatic and practical level. A good example is that the Council of Australian University Directors of IT includes the IT directors of both countries. If there were more examples of that, it would become more inevitable that we'd get better collaboration.
I think the other answer is Australia is participating in a lot of international initiatives, global initiatives around interconnectedness, and I think continuing to do that and being a global player actually is also part of the solution there. Now we've got time for, I think, one more short question. Actually, we probably don't have time. Is it a really short question? Yeah, okay.
Thank you. I'll try and make it a very short question. I just noticed with the appointment of Sir Tim Berners-Lee as the head of, co-director of the Open Data Institute in the UK, and 2 weeks ago the appointment of a minister for open data in Queensland, do we think that the expansion of the open data movement, whether for government data or others, would allow sufficient of our citizens to participate in using the data that would give an influence on government funding in future?
I'm not sure I'm the one to answer that question.
Public agendas of governments in terms of access. The word open can be applied to so many things. Open data is a whole realm in itself, and it's actually not the same as open content, about which there are some other things that come into play. But I mean, the short answer is yes, there's got to be an acceleration in both interest in and the solving of questions related to the enhancement of access through having open as the de facto way in which we will deploy data as time goes by. But there are many elements to the question. But I think a pendulum is swinging and swinging permanently.
So it's very obvious from our experience over the last 7 years that data isn't like anything else. And we kind of need a model for data. And where we've tried to go ahead, we've actually had to do a lot of consultation in every one of our projects related to data. And it's kind of like it's a big decision which no one really understands the implications of, and that's true all the time. So I think we don't really understand, my personal opinion is we don't understand open data, what the concept really is, and we absolutely understand that not all data is open. So we actually need a more flexible process for describing data. And I was very interested in the approach in the NSF that, this is really what the consultation's about, governance of data. And we can govern facilities, we can govern networks, but data isn't a computer and it isn't a network, and you don't time slice it. And it's a long-term decision, and you will never move it once it goes somewhere. You will never move it. So it's kind of a different thing, and I think the whole discussion for the next few years is really around understanding the concept of data.
Thank you. Before I close this session, I would just like to encourage you to remain here and hear the next speaker, the James Tizard Memorial Prize winner, because it is an example of how data is being used in this eResearch environment that's fairly new to Australia. So with that, I'd like to thank the three panellists for excellent presentations and also lively discussion.